Today we'll be looking at the book of Hosea and dealing with the theme of the Messianic restoration found in this minor prophet. By way of historical setting and background, the book of Hosea comes from the 8th century BC. Hosea was a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel. You'll remember that the kingdom divided after the reign of Solomon, and for several centuries, the northern kingdom existed alongside of the southern kingdom of Judah. Because of the wickedness of the northern kingdom, that kingdom fell in the year 722 BC. The fall of Samaria occurred on that date. They fell to the hands of the Assyrians. The kingdom of Judah would linger on for another century and several decades until finally the Babylonians would conquer Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah in 586 BC. But several of the prophets in the Old Testament, especially the minor prophets, this book of the 12 is the way the Jews referred to the minor prophets. This book of the 12, Hosea spoke primarily to the northern kingdom as well as did Amos the prophet. And even though Amos was a southerner, he came from the tribe of Judah, came from that region, from Tekoa, but he went to the northern kingdom and prophesied against the house of Israel. So in the prophets, sometimes we have to make a distinction between the term Israel as it relates to the entire nation, that kingdom that was founded there in Saul and David's reign, the united kingdom, and then that term Israel would then later on sometimes be used in a general way. But later then we have to distinguish that from the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Sometimes in the prophets, these kingdoms are given symbolic names or referred to with other terms. The northern kingdom, for example, is often referred to as Ephraim, and that's especially true here in the book of Hosea. Ephraim was considered to be the chief of the northern tribes, the most influential of the tribes. And so sometimes we refer to Israel and Judah, other times we read about Ephraim and Judah. And so Hosea is a prophet to the northern kingdom at a time just prior to its conquest at the hands of the Assyrians. And so we read in the first verse, we read about the word of the Lord came to Hosea, son of Beri, during the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the days of Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel. That's an interesting heading because it says that Hosea prophesied during the reigns of a number of different kings of Judah, taking us from Uzziah, who died in 740 BC, and all the way down to the time of Hezekiah. Now, for some reason, Hosea doesn't refer to any other kings other than Jeroboam. Jeroboam died in about 753 BC. And it's been suggested that the other kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, just weren't that significant or worth mentioning. But individuals like Zechariah and Shallum, who reigned only a few months between them, kings like Pekah and Pekahiah, Menahem, and Hoshea, round out the 6 other kings after Jeroboam up to the time that the northern kingdom fell in 722. You're probably familiar with the basic theme of the book of Hosea, and that is the imagery of the unfaithfulness of God's people. This is presented by way of the marriage of Hosea to the woman Gomer. And there's a lot of debate about exactly what transpired here, and we don't really have time to go into all of that. It would take a full session just to deal with some of the theories about the book of Hosea. The challenge is that in verse 2, God commanded Hosea to take for himself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord. And he went and he took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Now, this expression, wife of harlotry and children of harlotry, is a little bit difficult. Some have argued that Gomer was a harlot prior to being married to Hosea, and that is a distinct possibility. Others would say that that term harlotry only is used in retrospect. After her unfaithfulness to Hosea, she then could be called a wife of harlotry. Still others would argue that verse 2 tells us that the entire land was a land of harlotry, and so any wife and any children in that land could be called wives of harlotry and children of harlotry. And so those theories exist as far as the nature of the relationship and exactly what did happen. What is very clear is that Hosea's marriage is a way of symbolizing or representing God's relationship to His unfaithful bride or His unfaithful nation, Israel. The various children that are going to be born to Hosea through this marriage have special symbolic significance, and we're going to look at that here in just a moment. One argument against the idea that Gomer is somehow a symbolic figure, that the marriage is somehow figurative or in a vision or a dream, is that the name Gomer really doesn't seem to carry any special symbolic significance, unlike the names of the children, Jezreel and Lo-Ruhamah and Lo-Ami. Those children's names are addressed and significance is given to those particular names. In the case of Gomer, we just have her name mentioned. She is the daughter of Diblaim, and that sounds like she is a real person, and there is no real symbolism apparently conveyed through the name Gomer. In fact, chapter 1, verse 3 is the only occurrence of her name in the book of Hosea. There's another Gomer mentioned in Genesis 10. He was a son of Japheth, but that has nothing to do here with what we see here in the book of Hosea. Well, this marriage then represents this relationship and the pain and suffering that Hosea is caused by his unfaithful wife Gomer is to be a portrayal of the pain and suffering God experiences because of the unfaithfulness of His children, of His bride, of His people, Israel. We might say from the outset that the imagery of idolatry, or the concept of idolatry in the Old Testament prophets is often conveyed through the images of adultery or immorality, fornication. And so we have terminology like adultery, and Israel is described as an adulteress. In other places, the prophets refer to Israel basically as harlots, as prostitutes. We might make a distinction between adulterous relationships and prostitution, and there are technical distinctions to make. But in the prophets, that distinction really gets blurred. The image is that of unfaithfulness, uncleanness, and the Old Testament prophets refer to God's people as harlots and as adulterers, because they have broken the covenant bond that was to be maintained between them and their God. The thrust of the book is made pretty clear there in verse 4 of chapter 1. After the first son is named Jezreel, we read, "For yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel." Now note the similarity between the name Israel and Jezreel, and it sounds fairly similar in Hebrew as well. Jezreel is a name meaning God sows. God sows. Now, sowing of seed can have two significances, and both occur here in the book of Hosea. The first significance is one of scattering. And when you sow seed, you scatter it. Much like the northern kingdom of Israel is about to be scattered. And so when God says, "I will put an end to the house of Israel," verse 5, "I will then break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel." There is going to be a scattering of the nation. Israel is going to go into captivity. And the Bible records that very vividly. Ancient records from the Assyrians also document the devastation and the captivity of the northern kingdom of Israel. And so the name Jezreel has a negative connotation in this particular passage, that of scattering. God will sow, that is, He will scatter. On the other hand, that name Jezreel will have a positive significance. If we turn over to chapter 2 for just a moment, look at the last verse there, 2:23. God is going to restore His people someday, and when that happens, it says, I will sow her for myself in the land. There is the word zarah there in the sense of sowing seed, and so Jezreel has a significance there of God sowing. And I will have compassion on her who had not obtained compassion. And I will say to those who were not my people, you are my people, and they will say, thou art my God. And so the image of sowing in connection with the name of Jezreel, a negative significance of scattering, and then a positive significance of sowing and then reaping a harvest as a result of that. That's the first child born to Hosea and Gomer, a son. And then we learn that Gomer conceives again and bears a daughter, and she is given the symbolic name of Lo-Ruhamah. And Ruhamah means compassion. Lo-Ruhamah, no compassion, or not compassion. Name her Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel, that I should ever forgive them. Now in the prophets it's made clear that God's patience was tested by Israel, and that He held back His punishment and waited for repentance and waited for a change in the nation, but that change never came. And finally, God's patience ran out, and the northern kingdom was judged. And so Lo-Ruhamah represents their state right now as God is about to judge them and come to them through the hands of the Assyrian armies. Israel is Lo-Ruhamah, not no compassion. God is not going to spare them any longer. But then look at verse 7. I will have compassion on the house of Judah, and I will deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by bow, sword, battle, horses, or horsemen. One of the messages of the prophets is that God was at work in these circumstances, and that it was not the military might of Israel or Judah that really in the long run made the difference, but rather whether or not they were within the will of God and whether or not God was indeed fighting for them. And if they were on the side of God, then God promised them deliverance. We see that dramatically fulfilled later on in the year 701 BC. After the northern kingdom of Israel fell, Judah was also threatened by the Assyrians. And in 701 BC, in the days of Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria at that time, came and surrounded Jerusalem and brags in his inscriptions that he had Hezekiah shut up like a bird in a cage. And yet, the Bible records a miraculous deliverance of Jerusalem from the Assyrian armies. 185,000 Assyrian soldiers are wiped out overnight, and the Assyrians are forced to leave and to go back to Assyria, to Nineveh, without the great prize that they wanted in the campaign, and that was the city of Jerusalem. Hezekiah, shut up like a bird in a cage, apparently flew the coop. The Assyrians do not record this defeat, but then again, they never recorded defeats. They would just simply say something like, we fought the enemy and then we went home. When they got back, the Assyrians did celebrate their conquest of cities like Lachish. Sennacherib had a special room in his palace decorated with an art piece that surrounded the walls of the room, showing how they were able to conquer the city of Lachish. But I kind of view that as the consolation prize because Jerusalem escaped destruction. And so in 701 BC, God delivered Judah, and He did not do it by a bow, sword, battle, or horses, but rather it was through His power. And the Israelites at that time recognized the hand of God in that victory. They would misinterpret that later because some concluded that since God delivered them then, that God would never allow the city to be destroyed. Jeremiah the prophet had to fight that message. The false prophets appealed back to 701 and argued that God would never allow the temple to fall. And they pointed back to the time of Hezekiah as a proof text for that. But Jeremiah made it clear, as do the other prophets, that their relationship to God depended was the key to their success and the key to their staying in the land. It was not the existence of a temple or the existence of the holy city of Zion, but rather Jeremiah chapter 7 in the temple sermon emphasizes how God desires a relationship with His people and wants them to turn to Him in faith and in acts of kindness and charity and keeping the Sabbath day and obeying the law of Moses. And if they would truly be His people, then He would deliver them and would restore them. So that verse that says that He would have compassion on Judah, I think, is fulfilled in a rather dramatic way. Well, after the birth of Lo-Ruhamah then, Gomer conceives and bears a son again, and this son's name is Lo-Ami. And Lo-Ami means not my people. The Lord said, name him Lo-Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. And so the names of these three children of Hosea represent the calamity that is about to strike the nation. Jezreel, God is going to scatter the nation. Lo-Ruhamah, God is no longer going to show compassion upon them. And Lo-Ami, Israel has come so far away from God that they have become like another Gentile nation, and they have become not my people. But then out of this warning and out of these negative names comes a message of future hope for God's people. And so we read there in verses 10 and 11 of Hosea 1, a message of reunification. Yet the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And it will come about that in the place where it is said to them, you are not my people, it will be said to them, you are the sons of the living God. And the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together, and they will appoint for themselves one leader, and they will go up from the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. And in that sense, Jezreel speaks of God's sowing His people into the land. The outline that you following here talks about the reunification of the nation. Israel and Judah will come together, it says. They will be reunited. If we can turn over to chapter 3, verse 5 for just a moment, under the theme David, their king, we see how these ideas are tied together. Afterward, the sons of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. And they will come trembling to the Lord and to His goodness in the last days. Now, David their king in chapter 3, verse 5 is no doubt the one leader that is appointed there in chapter 1 and verse 11. So there are several themes that are emerging here in the book of Hosea. One is the promise concerning the line of David, that one of his seed would sit on the throne, and we saw that developed in 2 Samuel 7 and throughout the Psalms. Another theme now that we see is that of reunification, that someday God is going to bring Israel and Judah together, and they are going to be under the rule of one king. He's called David, even though David's been dead now for several centuries by the time of Hosea. Some prophecy students insist on literalism to the point that they demand that in the future, after Jesus comes, that David will be reinstated in a position of leadership, and they envision David and Jesus sitting on thrones, maybe next to one another, or maybe even switching off, Jesus shuttling back and forth to heaven and back to earth, and you read all kinds of interesting things that we'll talk about a little bit more at a later time. But I think it misses the point to try to make David a literal David, when in fact throughout the prophets and throughout the Psalms, it's obvious that there will be one from the line of David, the son of David, the seed of David, who is going to reign forever and ever. We see the same language, and why don't we go ahead and turn over to the book of Ezekiel here for just a moment and see how the theme of reunification is emphasized in that book. I'm thinking of chapters 34 and 37 in particular. This idea of a reunification under a single monarch, a single ruler. In the case of Ezekiel 34, Looking there now at verses 23 and 24. Then I will set over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will feed them, and he will feed them himself, and he will be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. Now, the theme of a shepherd is not simply one of lowly stature. We are often told in connection with the Christmas story that shepherds were the lowest on the rung of society, and so the poor shepherds were visited by the angels, and that has some special significance. Well, perhaps it does in that context, but also we need to know that the term shepherd is used as a metaphor in the ancient world in Old Testament times for kings. Kings called themselves the shepherds of their people. Great King Hammurabi, king of Babylon, was a great shepherd because the shepherd's role was to feed the flock, to provide for them. His role was to protect them, preserve them. And so if a king faithfully carried out the role of a shepherd for his people, then his people were grateful to him because he had brought stability and security to the land. So it's no surprise then that God refers to the kings of Israel and Judah as shepherds and generally refers to them as worthless shepherds. We could see that in Jeremiah 22 and 23. But also that God then takes on the role of shepherd, and he says, since my shepherds, my people have been failed by these wicked shepherds, I will be their shepherd, and I will restore the flock. I will bring them back from the lands where they have been scattered, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. I'm convinced that when Jesus said, I am the good shepherd, that his audience understood more in that phrase than typically we do today. And that some of them understood that as a claim to deity, because in the Jewish mind there was only really one good shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. The Lord is the one who restores his people and restores his flock. And so Jesus' claim that I am a good shepherd probably spoke in their minds to a claim of authority and power. And that, I think, gets lost today as we read some of those words. We kind of feel that's a warm, fuzzy thought for God being our shepherd, or Jesus saying, I am the good shepherd. And then when he says the good shepherd lays down his life, we recognize the price that Christ paid in atonement for us, but I think we maybe lose sight of the claim that he's making there when he calls himself the good shepherd. So God is the shepherd, and he speaks about Israel being the flock, and he says, I'll judge between my sheep, and I will make those decisions, and I will separate them, but I will also feed them and protect them. Well, if we turn over to Ezekiel 37 for just a moment, we see a similar passage here. Remember the context of Ezekiel 37, the valley of dry bones. And this has to do with Israel's restoration from captivity. Now here the term Israel may be used a little bit more general, but Judah is the primary focus here. They have been taken into the Babylonian captivity. And the prophet Ezekiel prophesies a restoration from captivity for the people of God. And this vision of the dry bones, the valley of dry bones, is a way of showing how God is going to restore the nation. Now we come to the latter part of chapter 37, verses 24, 25. My servant David will be their king over them, and they will have one shepherd. And they will walk in my ordinances and keep my statutes and observe them. And they shall live in the land that I gave to Jacob my servant, in which your fathers lived. They will live on it, they and their sons' sons forever. And David my servant will be their prince forever. Well, we'll come back a little bit more to the promise of the land forever, but I would argue that 1,000 years is not forever. And so any claim that somehow this means that there will be 1,000 years of peace on earth in which Israel will live in the land, that somehow that fulfills forever, to me that doesn't make much sense. I tend to point to what the Revelation speaks of there in Revelation 21 and 22, the promise of a new heavens and a new earth, and the promise of a new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. And clearly, someday God's people are going to dwell forever together, and I think that That probably speaks more to what Ezekiel is speaking of than the idea of a literal 1,000 years on earth, perhaps. And so they will live in the land. The concept of Canaan and the promise of Canaan and the rest that God gave His people when they entered into Canaan, as the book of Hebrews discusses, points to a future heavenly rest. And so there's a sense in which the land of Canaan functions as a type, a pattern of heaven itself. And so I would not be surprised if these passages are really viewing the eternal state and God dwelling with His redeemed forever. But note the theme of one servant, David, one shepherd. He is going to rule over them. And earlier there in chapter 37 of Ezekiel, picking it up now at verses 16 and following, we have this symbolic act where Judah and Ephraim are brought together in the form of the stick of Joseph and the stick of Judah. And they come together and they are made into one stick. That's in verse 19. And that indicates that somehow there will be a united nation someday. In verse 22, I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel, and one king will be king for all of them. They will no longer be two nations. They will no longer be divided into two kingdoms. Well, we come back to Hosea and we see that very same image here now. The sons of Israel and the sons of Judah will be united, gathered together under one leader. David their king, David their prince, David their shepherd. Now at this point, real quickly, I want us to turn to the book of Romans and see how the Apostle Paul understands this promise and what he does with this, because I think it's a very fundamentally important application in the New Testament, and I think it should serve us as a guide in our understanding of some of the language of these promises of restoration. Because Paul, in Romans chapter 9, quotes here from Hosea chapter 1, and in doing so, applies the theme of the reunification of Israel and Judah to the theme of the rest of the union now in the New Testament of Gentile and Jew. Israel, in essence, representing the Gentile world. Amos chapter 9, verse 7, God says to the northern kingdom there, have you not become as the sons of Ethiopia to me, O house of Israel? Israel had gotten so far away from God, they were just another nation in the eyes of God. And so it's not surprising that the northern kingdom could represent or symbolize the Gentile world as a whole. That's what Paul does here. He talks about those who are called not only from the Jews, but from the Gentiles, there in Romans 9:24. And then he goes on in verse 25, as he says in Hosea, I will call those who were not my people, and her who was not beloved, beloved. And it shall be in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. And Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel be as the sand of the sea, it is the remnant that will be saved. Now we're given some clues already in the book of Romans about this issue of Jew, Gentile, and what the new Israel is going to be like. We go back to chapter 2 of Romans, chapter 2, verse 28. We read that he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, neither is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter, and his praise is not from men, but from God. And so in the book of Romans, we start to see that God has a place for the Gentiles. We get to chapter 3 of Romans, verse 29. Is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of the Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also. And speaks about justifying both Jew and Gentile through faith and through grace. Chapter 4, Father Abraham is the father not only of the Jews, but of the Gentiles. This is the one who was reckoned as righteousness prior to circumcision. That's pointed out in verse 10. Abraham is referred to as the heir of the world, there in verse 13. In verse 17 of Romans 4, as it is written, a father of many nations have I made you. It becomes very clear that sons of God, through faith in Christ, sons of Abraham are not only physically descended from Israel as Jews, but anyone who accepts Christ in faith is a child of Abraham. Or back to chapter 9, verse 6. Paul argues, but it is not as though the word of God has failed, for they are not all Israel who are descended from Israel. Neither are they all children because they are Abraham's descendants, but rather through Isaac your descendants will be named. In other words, it's the children of promise, not the children of physical descent, that ultimately are to be saved. And so Paul in Romans 9 takes the language of Hosea, not my people, the northern kingdom of Israel, becoming my people, not compassion, lo rukama, becoming compassion. These images are applied by the Apostle Paul to the Gentile world. And so the theme of reunification in the prophets, I believe in the New Testament, is fulfilled by the union of Jew and Gentile into one new creation, the church. Now, Ephesians chapter 2 and chapter 3 very clearly develop this theme. Let me pick it up here real quickly at Ephesians 2:14. He himself, Christ, is our peace. He has made both groups into one and has broken down the barrier of the dividing wall. Speaks about making two into one new man, establishing peace. Verse 15. And so, therefore, verse 18, through him we both have access in one Spirit to the Father. And so you, Gentiles, are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and are of God's household. You see, previously they had been separated from the household of God. Back in verse 12, the uncircumcision, they had been separate from Christ, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel. They had been strangers to the covenants of promise, but now they have been brought near and are now fellow heirs. Chapter 3 develops that theme of the fact that Jew and Gentile now are fellow heirs in the body of Christ. And so this restoration that Hosea promises is ultimately fulfilled, I believe, in the New Testament church. Nowhere in history do we see the fulfillment, literal, of a reunification of the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah under some military leader or some king. But in the New Testament, we see how these things are fulfilled through Christ and the new Israel, the kingdom that was established when Christ came, and that both Jew and Gentile are a part of this new Israel.